In the autumn of 2022, Iran was rocked by a wave of national popular unrest, some of the most severe in recent years. The immediate cause of the revolt was the suspicious death of an Iranian Kurdish woman, Mahsa Jîna Amini, whilst in the custody of the Tehran police. Amini's death proved to be a lightning rod for discontent directed at the Islamist government in Iran, which took power after the 1979 revolution. Significantly, at the forefront of these protests were women who have long chafed under the strict moral codes imposed by the regime. However, while the Islamic Republic ultimately weathered the storm of public anger, this has left many asking, what does this mean for the future of the country? I'm Jean Badgelan, and you're listening to Talking History. To discuss the protests and their meaning, we're joined by journalist and author Fatemeh Jamalpour, co-author of the book For the Sun After Long Nights, the story of Iran's women-led uprising. Writing from Tehran during these historic events, Fatemeh risked her safety to bear witness to the voices of women and young people demanding freedom, dignity, and change. Ms. Jamalpour, welcome to Talking History.
Thank you for having me, Jane.
Well, it's a real pleasure to have you here, and I would like to begin by asking you really to describe the risks that you underwent. You were in Tehran at the time of these protests. What did it feel like to be a journalist at this time? And in particular, what is it like to be living under the gaze of the state and still, going ahead and writing about your story? I think there's a famous saying in Iran where they say, you have freedom of speech, but the next day we will put you in jail. So you can say what you want, but there will be consequences. So, how did you navigate that difficult situation, especially at this time of great tension and unrest? How was that for you personally?
Sure. So, I got arrested 3 times during my career. Once when I covered the women protest to go to the stadium because women were banned from entering a stadium to watch, matches and sport after the revolution. And the second time was during the November protest in 2019 when the regime shut down the internet and killed 1,500 protesters in 5 days. But this time was really different because I was already under interrogation. So 6 months before the movement happened, I was working at BBC in London, and I realized that my father got cancer and I had to return to Iran. Upon arriving in the airport, they arrested me. Many officers from the Ministry of Intelligence were waiting me with the gun, with the camera, It was like arresting me like a real criminal. And then for the next 6 months, I was even in the interrogation sessions or beside my father's bed. 4 days after Jîna was killed, this Kurdish woman, I got summoned. And they told me that they are going to send my case to the court, and my imprisonment would be 2 to 5 years in prison. So I left the interrogation session. I walked through the protests in the streets. I arrived home, I opened my laptop, I emailed my friends Nilu at the New York Times, and I said, do you want to cover the protest together? Because I feel that I have nothing to lose, and I wanted really to do meaningful things for my people. And then I started to cover the protest. While covering the protest, I got shot by bullet. But I continue reporting plastic bullet. And it was huge violence. They just targeted, shoot at the protester, doesn't matter, young, old, children, And it was a huge violation that I haven't experienced. But on the other hand, I witnessed really contagious courages that keep me, just keep me doing reporting the protest, because I know that's a new thing. That was a protest for good things, for freedom, for gender equality. And I see all of those young people and women who were there and who willing to lose their lives to achieve the free future.
The coverage in the West obviously was very curious about these these protests. Just as a brief aside, how did these protests compare with, let's say, earlier protests that you've witnessed in Iran? Was there a big difference? There's been protests, most notably the Green Movement in 2009 over the elections. And as you mentioned, you've been previously been under surveillance and arrested by the Iranian state for other protests, such as in 2019. How did these protests differ? Were they bigger than those previous protests? Were they more widespread? Were they a broader section of society undergoing these protests?
Sure. The previous protests, each of them was limited to one class. Like 2009 were mostly middle class, or 2019 were mostly working class, or only in Tehran or big city. But the women life freedom movement protest spread to all part of the countries, all part of the cities. Doesn't matter if it was a rich neighborhood in north of Tehran or really deprived and marginalized neighborhood in south of Tehran, or even in a small village we see the protests, and it was from all classes and gender. Doesn't matter. I remember once I was near to being arrested and ordinary men came to save me. Mm-hmm. And it was a thing that we never experienced, that kind of solidarity. The other things is that in previous protests, the rich people didn't attend. But after the COVID and Corona, the Supreme Leader banned, importing vaccine, and they lost their loved ones, and they realized it's important who is running the country. So this time we witnessed the protests in rich neighborhood as well. The other thing was about Generation Z. They were more brave, and they were in the street for months. As it was not like the November protest that the regime could suppress within a week. The protest continues for a month. And the differences was being widespread to all the classes, to all the genders, to all minorities, from the Kurdish to Baluchis, to the Arab, to Turk, It was all the people united against the regime.
So in that way, it was very different, whereas previous protests had been limited to a particular group within society or a particular ethnic minority or a particular region of the country. This one was truly, a mass uprising of the type we saw in 1979, or perhaps of the type we saw in 1905, 1906, like these moments in Iranian history where it's not simply one group rebelling against a government, but the whole of society revolting against the regime that they see as tyrannical.
Exactly. The other things, I think, is economic situation. The inflation there is huge. And nowadays, about 30 million people living under poverty line. Even the middle class cannot afford buying fruit, or millions of people have not eaten chicken and meat. The mainly people eating potato and eggs. And because of all of the corruption of the regime and sanctions that was the result of the regime-long policy. So it's about being squeezed, by the sanction, economic pressure, and also strictness of the hijab law and, the Shia state. People got exhausted about each aspect of this regime.
So it's not just one factor that's coming into play. It's not just, for example, people are angry about the headscarf, but that's combined with a lot of other issues in society as well. And this becomes a kind of symbol of the regime. I mean, as far as I understand, for example, in Iran today, those with connections to the regime can get advantages in the economic system. And middle-class people who previously may have been wealthy, they have to sell their things, and they sell them to people in the regime.
Exactly. Nowadays, 80% of the society, according to statistics of people from inside Iran, are against the regime.
So let's turn to your book. So in your book, you there are lots of different things that we could cover in the book. There are parts where you're kind of show that people were scared and upset, but also that people, despite the fear that they had, they continued to resist against the regime, and in face of a kind of significant deployment of violence against those protests. Out of all these things, what was the what was the most difficult thing for you to put into words to communicate to your audience? And why did you think it was important to not leave certain things out of the book? What were the really striking things that you really, let's say some incidents or some groups of people? How did you kind of be a journalist at the same time as being sympathetic to these people who are protesting?
Sure. So there have been many sections that was hard for me to write about. But, working as a journalist for a long time has taught me to be empathetic, to try to work with other people's shoes. So when I wrote the chapter about the execution, if I want to provide the background, after the months of the protest and movement, the regime started to execute the young protesters to just suppress the people and scare them to empty the streets. And the first one was 23 young man who was gamer. The regime brought him to the national TV, confessed that he got corrupted by playing online gaming, and the day after they executed him while he was innocent. So during the time that I wrote that chapter, I didn't want to just write about them as a victim. I want to bring them even for a moment to their life, like what's their favorite food, what was their hobby. I want to show them as a human being, that the people could see them as their brother, as their sister, as their daughter, not just only simple victim. Or another chapter that I wrote was about a 7-year-old boy that got killed by the regime in the first months of the protest, and how his mom trying to use Instagram as a tool for seeking justice. And in his anniversary, the regime killed his cousin and they shut down his mom pages. It's just about witnessing brutality and also resistance and trying to convey it, to represent it for the audiences, that these people are victims, but they are also heroes.
So, it's so easy for people when they hear about protests in other countries just to think of people as not even names, but this number of people were killed, this person was killed, and we don't really hear the kind of personal stories and the lives that those people who are victimized.
Exactly.
So one really important aspect of which I think is very central in your book and also central to our understanding of this protest movement is the role played by women. And many of them, as you've hinted at, were very young women. I think people who may have followed these protests may have seen not just university students. Obviously, university students famously are involved in all protest movements, but high school students, people in the middle school, people who would be studying for their concours, their big national examination, and who this is a big threat to them, because the Iranian examination system dictates whether you go to the medical school or the engineering school, or this was people don't think of the risks that young people take, but this was a very risky time, and especially for young women who in the years since the foundation of the Islamic Republic have had to suffer under this extremely strict moral code that is imposed on society, and really is a kind of raison d'etre or a basis of the regime, the kind of control over women. So what struck you the most about women's role in these protests? And despite the repression that many of these women have faced at the hands of the regime, how do you think their resistance has changed Iranian society?
Sure. So I want to mention a recent story and then provide the background. I had an interview with a student activist who got prison, and how she got arrested was exactly in the way that I got arrested once time. They drag her on the, ground, they beat her, they kick her, they snap on her face. And when I heard her story, I started crying and I said, I'm sorry, because we did our best that your generation wouldn't go through what my generation went through. And she said, you shouldn't be sorry. We stand on your shoulders. And I think the women fight, one thing that people in the West don't know about it is that our fight against mandatory hijab was not even for after Jina's death, After 1979 revolution, when the supreme leader and the founder of the regime declared that the women are naked and should be wearing hijab in all the state and organization and in public, women started marching, and hundreds and thousands of women protesting for 6 days in the street in March 1979, which delayed mandatory hijab for 3 years to be a rule. But at that time, women were alone. Iranian men were afraid of the modern Iranian women and stand by the regime. But during these 4 decades, Iranian men realized that their freedom ties to Iranian women, and they should stand by the women's side. And also, we have many movement and protests for women's rights. Like we have 1 million campaign signature that during that time, people trying to collect 1 million campaign to change the rule that were against the women in family. Also, we have another protest against the mandatory hijab in 2018 that we call it the Girls of Inqilab Street, when the young, old, all women standing on the platforms across the city and waving their scarf, in the air. And all of them got arrested and jailed and beaten, and the regime accused them to being mentally health ill, is how they treated all of these rebellion women. But I remember in the first day of the protest, since that movement in 2019, we always carry our hijab around our shoulder. We didn't put it in our head. When we saw the morality police, we put the hijab in our head. But during the protest, I was heading to the protest. I had my shoulder around my neck, and I see all of these 14, 15 years old girl walking without hijab in front of riot police, and I got ashamed, and I put my scarf in my back. I never carried it again. It was just contagious courage from this young generation. I think the reason that they stand for freedom that much was that they grew up with the internet, and they really want a similar life like other generation Z across the globe. They grow up by awareness, by knowing their right. And despite my generation, we tried to reform, they decided to live the life that they wanted and pay for the expenses.
So, it was the young people who were kind of breaking the wall of fear around the headscarf issue, which is a highly symbolic issue. There's something I would like to follow up on that you mentioned. So, in the West, obviously, people focus on the hijab issue. It's, a very visible sign of protest and a visible sign of the regime. But you mentioned that, these are not the only, women aren't just protesting because, they want to take off the hijab. I think sometimes some interpretations try to downplay the revolt as just, they just care about their hair and they want to show off their bodies. They want to be immodest. But there are a lot of other issues in Iran. I mean, my students, when I teach Middle Eastern history, have very strange ideas about Iran. They think women can't read, or they don't, they're not allowed to go out the house. But, the Iranian woman population, and it's a kind of paradox of the Islamic Republic that, women actually have attained a lot of educational success in the Islamic Republic for a variety of different reasons. So it's a highly educated population. What are some of the other critical issues that women are concerned about beyond the issue of the headscarf?
Sure, the first thing that I want to say is that hijab is really critical for the regime, because it's how they shows that this society is Islamic. This state is Shia Muslim. And the other thing is that women realize that the one who tell us how to cover our body is going to tell us how to think. It's not about the hijab, it's about our agency over our bodies. But we have many problems, like we cannot get divorced in Iran as a woman. And I witnessed many of my friends fighting for years, just like 7 years to got divorced, from their abusive husband. Or the other things is that we cannot leave the country without our husband permission, and many Iranian men just ban their wives from leaving the countries. And there are many restrictions like that in each aspects of our lives. But like in recent years, the young generation, when they want to marry, they ask to get the divorce right, despite what's happening in the rule and what the constitution is. And many young husbands accepted that. So despite the state and its restricted, religious rules, society is moving its own way. It's moving towards secularism. It's moving toward equality.
Okay, another aspect of your book, which is quite interesting, is about the role of poetry, chants, and songs that became part of this protest. There have been academic writings, for example, on the importance of poetry in protest movements and in Iranian history, most notably writers such as Fatemeh Jamalpour at Pennsylvania University. And, one of the slogan of this protest, Women, Life, Freedom, has an interesting genealogy because it originally is a slogan of the Kurdistan Workers' Party, which is a left-wing guerrilla organization that has been fighting against the Turkish government since 1984. How did that slogan come to Iran in particular? And, why did such slogans resonate with the public?
So the first time that the people shouted this slogan was at Jîna's funeral, because as we know, Jîna's family were Kurdish. And one of the reasons that the regime couldn't cover her death was her family, because Kurdish people has a long, history of fighting against the regime. Like in 1979, many of them got executed because they were leftists. So when her family wanted to have, funeral for Jîna, the regime tried to force them to bury her body sooner than before crowded. But her family didn't let the security forces, and thousands of the people attended her funeral and chanted "Women, Life, Freedom," which, as you mentioned, came from Öcalan ideas. He was the leader of the Kurdish people in Turkey. And when he was a child, his sister forced to marry at the age of 9 or 10 in exchange with some wheat and some food. So when he was in prison, he released an article that revolution is a woman, and equality and freedom is without meaning, without women freedom. So that was the first time that the people chanted "Women, Life, Freedom," and it's spread to the protests in the Tehran and across the country, because it's really resonated with us, with what we want. We want the women to be free. We want all the minorities and people to be free, and we want life, normal life.
Okay, so one last question I have for you is the book's title, For the Sun After Long Nights. It's a kind of optimistic title. I'd like to ask, after all this protest, the government seems to have, reasserted control. It has weathered various foreign policy and internal issues over the last few years since the protest. But how firm do you think the authority of the Islamic Republic is today?
You know that they are not able to impose hijab anymore. The million of Iranian women in public nowadays with optional hijab. And in this summer, I saw my friends' photos and videos, running in the city in public in a sport bra and shorts. And it was unimaginable for the majority of my life to see such a scene. And women just make the regime, disable to impose the hijab law by their bravery, by pushing the boundaries. And I think it's a huge, victory. And I'm really optimistic about the future, as our book title is, because nowadays meaning human rights activists demanding for a referendum. And I believe that the regime change going to happen soon or late, because all of these changes happen from the grassroots, and these are long lasting.
So, the regime might have political and economic control still over the country, but its social control is breaking down because of the mass resistance of people.
Yeah, exactly. One example is that one day a head of the police set an alarm for women and said, from this Saturday, we are going to arrest all the women without hijab in a street. And thousands of women walk without hijab, in a street, took photo of themselves and published on social media with the hashtag of the name of the head of the police that was rode on Saturday, to just humiliate, the head of the police. It's how the people respond to those, regime strictness. And in other aspect, also this regime is failure, as you heard. People don't have electricity for many hours in a day. People don't have drinking water, It's totally a failure state that took control of the country by guns.
Well, that's all we have time for today, but I want to thank you, Ms. Jamalpour, for joining us today. And you've been listening to Talking History, a co-production of KSMU Radio and Missouri State University Department of History. You can find Talking History as a podcast from ksmu.org or wherever you find your podcasts.